The Day I Died Inside and Became the Demon They Created is a haunting tale of betrayal, loss, and transformation. It unravels the emotional descent of Kaelith, a soul once pure, forced into darkness by the very hands that once claimed to protect him. This story balances raw emotion with chilling suspense, showing how a broken heart can give birth to something far more dangerous than death itself. Trust is the foundation of every bond we hold close, yet when it breaks, it leaves behind wounds that never truly heal. For Kaelith, trust wasn't simply a word. It was the lifeline he clung to when the world around him felt unsteady and cruel. The people he gave his loyalty to, the ones he believed would shelter him from harm, were the very ones who tore him apart. He never suspected that the ones who smiled in his presence, who whispered words of comfort, were sharpening blades behind his back. That shattering moment came not with thunder or fire, but in quiet betrayals that echoed louder than any scream. He remembered the warmth of their promises, the way they told him he mattered, and yet each assurance was nothing more than a carefully crafted lie meant to bind him before they broke him. It began with small cracks in the walls of trust. Subtle silences, half-truths, and shadows in their eyes whenever he asked questions that deserved honesty. At first he ignored them, convincing himself that love and loyalty were stronger than doubt. But doubt has a way of whispering in the dark, gnawing at the heart until it cannot be ignored. Kaelith replayed conversations in his mind, realizing too late how many times he had been deceived. Every memory that once brought comfort now felt poisoned, like a sweet drink laced with venom. His world, once steady, began to crumble, and with every lie uncovered, a part of him was stripped away. The shattering of trust is not always sudden. It can be slow, deliberate, like watching glass fracture under pressure before it finally shatters into irreparable pieces. Kaelith lived through that slow breaking. He watched those closest to him, the people he had once defended at all costs, strip away his dignity piece by piece. Betrayal is cruel because it doesn't only steal love or loyalty, it steals the version of yourself that once believed in goodness. Kaelith no longer saw himself as a man who could trust. Instead, he became a hollow reflection of someone who had loved too deeply and believed too blindly. The betrayal left him standing in a world where nothing felt safe. Every smile looked like a disguise, every promise sounded like a trap. He found himself questioning not only those around him but also the worth of his own heart. Was he a fool for believing? Was he weak for caring? The questions burned inside him, circling endlessly, offering no comfort. In his silence, he began to understand the cruelty of trust shattered. It doesn't only break your bond with others, it breaks your bond with yourself. Kaelith could still feel the sting of that moment. The exact second he realized everything he held dear was nothing but a facade. His body remembered the weight in his chest, the way his breath caught as if the air itself turned against him. Betrayal doesn't strike with clean wounds. It festers, infects, and spreads until it consumes everything. He felt it in his veins, a sickness born of heartbreak, transforming warmth into bitterness. The worst part wasn't the lies themselves, but the faces behind them. Faces he had trusted, hands he had held, voices he had once found comfort in, all revealed as masks hiding darker intentions. He wasn't betrayed by strangers. He was destroyed by the ones he loved most. That is why the breaking was irreversible. Once trust dies in such a way, it cannot be resurrected. It leaves behind a hollow silence that no apology, no excuse, no desperate attempt at repair could ever fill. Kaelith realized he could no longer return to who he was before. The boy who believed in promises was gone, and in his place stood someone who had tasted the sharp bitterness of betrayal. Innocence does not survive such wounds. It withers, leaving behind something harder, colder, more dangerous. And though Kaelith never sought vengeance in the beginning, the loss of trust planted seeds he could no longer control. His heart, once open, became a locked chamber filled with shadows, and those shadows whispered louder than any voice of reason. Every memory of trust shattered replayed itself like a cruel theater in his mind. He remembered the warmth of their hands, the glimmer of sincerity in their eyes, and the crushing weight when he discovered it was all a lie. He relived the laughter he thought was genuine, only to realize it was hollow, mocking him for believing. Each recollection was another knife turned in the wound, and yet he could not stop himself from remembering. That is the curse of betrayal. It forces you to replay the very moments you long to forget. Kaelith's soul fractured under the weight of it all. The betrayal didn't just strip him of love, it stripped him of trust in humanity itself. He no longer believed in kindness, no longer trusted compassion. Every smile looked like a predator's grin, every kind word a step toward another blade in his back. He became distant, not because he wanted to, but because he could not survive another wound of that kind. The walls he built weren't for protection. They were prisons, locking him away from a world that had proven too cruel to face unguarded. This was the moment he truly died inside. Not in a blaze of glory or the final beat of his heart, but in the silent fracture of trust that left him hollow. Kaelith wasn't killed by weapons or enemies. He was undone by the betrayal of those he had trusted most. And in that undoing, something darker began to awaken. Innocence is the first thing taken when betrayal strikes. For Kaelith, innocence was not a simple naivety. It was the fragile hope that goodness could still exist in a world already scarred by cruelty. He carried that belief like a lantern in the dark, guiding him through storms of doubt and hardship. Yet when betrayal finally came, that lantern was extinguished in a single breath, leaving only smoke and ash in its place. He had clung to the purity of love, to the faith that loyalty meant permanence, and in doing so he had opened himself entirely. But what he did not see was that innocence is a vulnerability predators crave. It becomes an offering, a weakness to exploit, and Kaelith's was torn apart in a way that could never be rebuilt. The fire of betrayal does not burn quickly. It devours slowly, licking at the edges of everything you are until you can no longer remember the warmth of who you used to be. Kaelith felt that fire consume him. The words once spoken to him with affection now echoed with venom, and the promises he held close dissolved like paper in the rain. Each revelation of deceit was another spark, and soon the inferno raged, leaving nothing untouched. Where innocence once lived, bitterness began to grow, sprouting roots so deep they reached into the marrow of his soul. He found himself no longer able to smile without suspicion, no longer able to love without doubt. Kaelith's innocence had been his gift to the world. He trusted too easily, gave too much, and believed that those he cherished would protect the light within him. That belief was shattered in ways too brutal to ignore. He began to see the faces of those he trusted not as companions but as architects of his undoing. He realized they had fed on his willingness to forgive, on his unshakable loyalty, until there was nothing left but a hollowed shell. The purity of his heart, the innocence that made him different, was reduced to embers in a fire he never asked to ignite. The loss of innocence is not only a loss of trust in others, it is a loss of self. Kaelith stood in the ruins of who he used to be, unable to recognize the boy who once believed in love without conditions. That boy had dreamed of futures, of bonds that would never break, of hands that would never let go. But betrayal ripped those dreams to shreds, leaving them to scatter in the wind like ashes from a fire that burned too hot. He understood now that innocence was never meant to survive in a world where masks were worn more often than truth. He could still feel the sting of the moment it broke. Innocence doesn't shatter with sound. It collapses silently like glass splintering beneath the weight of betrayal. Kaelith remembered the emptiness in his chest, the suffocating realization that everything he had believed in was nothing more than illusion. There was no going back from that kind of loss. Once innocence burns, it cannot be recovered. It does not return like a flame rekindled. It leaves only scars that throb in silence. As the fire consumed him, Kaelith began to see himself through darker eyes. He was no longer the one who hoped for peace, no longer the one who sought love without conditions. Every act of betrayal hardened him. Every lie fueled a transformation that dragged him further away from the innocence he once cherished. He felt the shadows take root, whispering that the world was never meant for the pure, that those who hold light will always be the first to be destroyed. The warmth inside him began to freeze, turning kindness into caution, trust into suspicion, and love into something dangerous. The loss of innocence carried with it a terrible clarity. Kaelith saw truths he had once been blind to, truths too painful for an innocent heart to bear. He saw how promises were tools of manipulation, how affection could mask deceit, and how loyalty could be exploited until it suffocated. The clarity cut deeper than the betrayal itself. It was like seeing the world through broken glass, jagged, distorted, yet undeniably real. There was no comfort in this vision, only the knowledge that he had been remade into something harder, colder, forged in the fire of betrayal. Innocence lost does not simply vanish, it transforms. It twists into resentment, sharpens into vengeance, and hardens into survival. Kaelith began to carry his scars like armor, but underneath that armor lay a hollow silence where innocence had once lived. He no longer recognized the softness of who he was, no longer felt the warmth of his own heart without remembering how easily it had been crushed. He understood now that once innocence is stolen, it leaves behind a void that hungers, a void that waits to be filled with something darker than what was lost. Kaelith did not choose to lose his innocence. It was ripped from him in the cruelest of ways. It was taken in whispers, in lies and the laughter of those who had plotted against him. It was stolen when he realized that the people he cherished most had built their happiness on his pain. That theft left him broken in ways invisible to others but felt in every breath he took. He could not return to who he was, no matter how much he wished to. The fire had burned too deep, and what remained was no longer the same man who once believed that love and loyalty could protect him. Pain doesn't always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it lingers in the quiet festering beneath the surface, invisible to everyone except the one who carries it. For Kaelith, the betrayal he endured left behind a scream so loud it rattled every corner of his soul. Yet to the outside world it was silence. No one saw the way his hands trembled when he was alone. No one heard the way his thoughts tore through him in the darkness. He smiled when he had to, nodded when spoken to, and played the part of someone whole. But inside, he was drowning in the echo of a scream that never found release. That silence became his curse, a prison where every unanswered cry for help carved him deeper into isolation. The silent scream began the moment he realized the people he trusted had destroyed him. The betrayal was not just an act, it was an unraveling, a dismantling of everything that made him who he was. But when he tried to speak, when he attempted to share the weight that pressed down on him, his voice failed. The words felt meaningless because how could language capture the enormity of what he felt? How could anyone understand the way it feels when the ground beneath you collapses, and the faces you loved the most are the ones who pushed you into the abyss? So he kept it inside, a scream held within the walls of his chest, clawing at his ribs, desperate for release. Those around him mistook his silence for strength. They thought his stillness meant he was handling it, that his quiet demeanor was proof of composure. But inside, Kaelith was anything but composed. He was shattering, splintering into pieces no one could see. His silence wasn't strength, it was survival. He feared that if he opened his mouth, if he allowed the scream to escape, it would consume everything in its path. So he locked it away, burying it deep where no one could reach, even though it tore him apart from within. The silent scream became part of him, a constant companion. At night, when the world was still, it grew louder, filling the spaces where hope used to live. It clawed at him when he tried to sleep, reminding him of everything he had lost. His body ached with it, his chest heavy with the pressure of words unsaid and pain unacknowledged. He felt like a ghost in his own life, walking through days with a hollow smile while the real Kaelith, the broken one, remained hidden in the shadows of his silence. It is a cruel truth that people rarely hear what is not spoken. They looked at him and saw only what they wanted to see. They saw the mask, not the man. They didn't notice the heaviness in his eyes, the way his hands clenched when he thought no one was watching. His pain was invisible, and because it was invisible, it was dismissed. That dismissal cut almost as deep as the betrayal itself. It told him that his suffering didn't matter, that his silent scream would echo forever without ever finding an ear to hear it. Kaelith often wondered if anyone truly wanted to know the depths of his pain. The world is quick to demand strength but slow to bear witness to weakness, so he kept silent. Not because he wanted to, but because he believed no one cared to listen. That belief only fed the scream inside him, turning it into something monstrous, something that lived beneath his skin and whispered to him in the quiet. The more he hid it, the more it consumed him. He became both the keeper of his scream and its victim, trapped in a cycle of silence that no one around him could see. The scream was not just pain. It was anger, grief, betrayal, and despair all bound together. It wanted to be heard, but he could not let it out. He feared the destruction it would cause. If he screamed, the truth would spill with it, and the truth was too raw, too jagged to ever be accepted. So he swallowed it down day after day until silence became his only language. On the surface he was calm, composed, almost unshakable. But beneath, he was burning, his soul scorched by the fire of words unsaid. The silent scream became the bridge between who he was and what he was becoming. Each day he held it in. Each night he carried its weight. The more he felt himself slipping away from the person he once knew. He no longer recognized the face in the mirror, not because it had changed, but because the scream behind it had hollowed him out. The world saw Kaelith, but what they didn't see was the echo of a soul crying out for someone, anyone, to listen. There were moments when he wished someone would notice. Someone would ask not how he was, but if he was truly okay. But no one ever did. His silence became their permission to ignore the truth. His scream went unheard, not because it wasn't there, but because no one cared enough to look beneath the surface. That realization drove the scream deeper into him, twisting it into something darker. It was no longer a cry for help. It was a cry for recognition, for justice, for vengeance. It was a soundless roar that promised he would never again allow his pain to be invisible. Transformation is rarely sudden. It happens slowly in pieces, until the person you once were is nothing more than a memory blurred by pain. For Kaelith, the transformation began with betrayal, but it did not end there. Each wound he carried, each silent scream buried within him, reshaped him into something he never imagined becoming. The world had taken from him his trust, his innocence, and his hope, leaving behind only fragments of a man who no longer fit into the skin he once wore. He began to see himself not as he was, but as the reflection of what others had made him. What stared back at him in the mirror was not Kaelith the loyal, Kaelith the dreamer, or Kaelith the believer. It was something harder, colder, unrecognizable even to his own eyes. At first, he resisted the change. He clung desperately to what remained of his humanity, to the small sparks of light he believed still flickered in his soul. But pain is relentless and silence is corrosive. The weight of betrayal gnawed at him until resistance became impossible. The softness that once defined him began to rot, replaced by an edge that cut deeper with each passing day. He no longer spoke in the same tone, no longer moved with the same gentleness. Even the way he looked at the world had shifted. Where once he saw possibilities, he now saw threats. Where once he saw companionship, he now saw deception waiting to strike again. The transformation carved itself into him like scars carved into flesh. His laughter disappeared first, replaced by a hollow smirk that never reached his eyes. His warmth vanished next, leaving his touch cold and distant. Slowly, piece by piece, the man who had once loved too much and trusted too easily faded away, replaced by a being molded in betrayal's image. He no longer dreamed of love or loyalty, for he understood those things as illusions. Instead, he began to embrace the darkness he had once fought against, finding a strange, bitter strength in the very shadows that haunted him. Kaelith felt as if he were standing between two worlds, the one he had lost and the one he was becoming. The past pulled at him, reminding him of who he had once been, while the present pushed him into a shape unrecognizable even to himself. His reflection became a stranger's face, eyes hollow and burning with an intensity that frightened even him. He realized that the transformation was not a choice, it was survival. The betrayal had killed the man he used to be, and in his place something new was rising, something that bore the scars of his suffering like armor. There is a terrifying beauty in transformation through pain. It strips you bare, leaves you vulnerable, and then forces you to grow sharper edges to survive. Kaelith's transformation was not graceful, nor was it kind. It was jagged, brutal, forged in the fire of heartbreak. The purity he once held had been consumed, leaving behind only the ashes of a soul too weary to keep hoping. And from those ashes, he rose not as himself, but as the demon they had unknowingly created. His compassion, once boundless, narrowed to suspicion. His loyalty, once unquestioned, hardened into vengeance. The qualities that made him human faded into echoes, drowned out by the darker instincts that now defined him. Those around him did not notice the shift at first. To them, he was simply quieter, more distant, perhaps still grieving. But the transformation was deeper than grief, it was a rebirth. The fire of betrayal had burned away everything soft, everything human, and replaced it with something relentless. His silence was no longer emptiness, it was calculation. His stillness was no longer weakness, it was patience. Every part of him that had once belonged to innocence was gone, replaced by a form that existed only because cruelty had demanded it. Kaelith could feel the demon within him stirring, not as a foreign presence, but as a natural extension of what betrayal had carved into him. It was not an external force pressing in, but an internal one pressing out. The darkness was his own, awakened by pain and nurtured by silence. He did not recognize his own thoughts anymore. Where once he might have sought forgiveness, he now dreamed of reckoning. Where once he had prayed for healing, he now longed for justice that would leave scars as deep as the ones carved into him. The transformation was complete not when he chose it, but when he realized he could no longer turn back. The boy who once believed in love was gone. The man who trusted in loyalty was dead. In their place stood a figure unrecognizable, a shadow forged of heartbreak, betrayal, and silence. He had not wanted this fate, but he could not deny what he had become. Revenge rarely begins as a choice. It begins as a wound, festering and unhealed, twisting every thought until the line between survival and vengeance disappears. For Kaelith, revenge was not born out of desire, it was born out of necessity. The betrayal that shattered his trust and burned away his innocence left him with nothing to cling to except the promise that he would never be powerless again. He told himself he was only trying to survive, only trying to protect what little of himself remained. But deep inside he knew that survival and revenge had become indistinguishable. Each step he took forward carried the shadow of both, intertwined like vines choking the same tree. At first he disguised it even from himself. He whispered that he only wanted to be strong enough not to break again. He convinced himself that the walls he built were for safety, that the fire he nurtured inside him was only to keep the cold away. But those walls became impenetrable, shutting out more than just threats, and that fire began to consume rather than warm. The truth lingered in the corners of his mind. Survival alone was not enough. To truly survive, he needed to balance the scales. To breathe without chains, he needed to ensure those who betrayed him would taste the same suffocation they had forced upon him. Revenge was a dangerous seed, but once planted, it grew quickly. Every sleepless night watered it. Every memory of betrayal fed it, and every silent scream pushed it deeper into his marrow. It no longer felt like something separate from him. It was part of his survival instinct, as natural as breathing. He did not fantasize about retribution in wild, fiery bursts. Instead, his thoughts became meticulous, patient, deliberate. He wore his pain like armor, and sharpened his silence into a weapon, preparing himself for the day when survival would no longer mean hiding, but striking. The mask of survival made him appear calm to others. They saw a man who had endured, who had grown stronger through suffering. They praised his resilience, never realizing that resilience was only the surface. Beneath it, revenge was coiled tight, waiting for the moment to unfurl. To Kaelith, revenge was no longer about cruelty or satisfaction. It was about reclaiming what was stolen. They had taken his innocence, his trust, his very identity, and left him hollow. The only way he could feel whole again was to take something back, even if it meant becoming the very shadow they had forced him to be. Kaelith often told himself he wasn't seeking revenge. He was only ensuring that he would never be broken again. But the distinction blurred each time he remembered their lies, their laughter, their betrayal. Each time he replayed those moments, his survival felt empty without the weight of justice. He didn't want to simply endure. He wanted them to endure too. He wanted their nights to be haunted, their hearts to be scarred, their lives to carry the same cracks they had carved into his. And so survival took on a new shape, a darker one, where every breath was fueled by the promise of reckoning. The transformation into something unrecognizable had given him the tools. He no longer flinched at the thought of cruelty, no longer hesitated at the edge of shadows. He had become what they feared, a product of their own betrayal, a demon molded from pain. To Kaelith, revenge wasn't about destruction for the sake of it. It was balance. It was the only way to silence the scream that lived within him, the only way to soothe the fire that devoured him night after night. Without it, his survival felt incomplete, like a body without a soul. Revenge disguised itself in every choice he made. When he stayed silent, it was because silence gave him the advantage. When he withdrew, it was because distance sharpened his focus. When he smiled faintly at those who betrayed him, it was not forgiveness, it was patience. He wore the mask of survival so convincingly that even he sometimes believed it. But the truth always revealed itself in the quiet, when he was alone. His thoughts always drifted back to the same place, the same hunger, the same need to see justice drawn not in words but in scars. And so, Kaelith lived in duality. To the world, he was a man who had endured betrayal and risen from its ashes. But inside he was a storm, a shadow fueled by vengeance disguised as survival. He did not announce his intentions, nor did he act impulsively. He waited, watched, and carried the weight of his pain like a blade hidden beneath his cloak. Survival had made him endure, but revenge would make him whole again. The final stage of Kaelith's descent was not marked by a single event, but by the gradual realization that there was no turning back. He had resisted. He had grieved. He had tried to hide his darkness beneath the mask of survival. But the longer he carried the weight of betrayal, the more the demon within him became the only thing that felt real. It was not an intruder forcing itself into his soul. It was the reflection of everything he had endured, the shadow of every broken promise, the embodiment of every silent scream. What once began as defense, as survival, as the desperate attempt to shield himself from further pain, had grown into something absolute. The demon was no longer a mask he wore. It was who he was. Kaelith could still remember the man he used to be, but the memory felt distant, almost like it belonged to someone else. The boy who believed in trust, the man who carried innocence, the soul who once loved freely, all of them had died in the fire of betrayal. What remained was not a fractured version of the old Kaelith, but an entirely new being forged in suffering. He had tried to fight it, tried to cling to remnants of the light he once carried, but light requires faith and faith requires trust. Both had been stolen from him, leaving no foundation for goodness to grow. The demon became his foundation, his identity, the truth he could no longer deny. There was a strange freedom in the acceptance. He no longer had to pretend to be the man who smiled despite his wounds. He no longer had to silence the roar inside him or disguise vengeance as necessity. He could embrace the reality that the world had created in him. The demon did not ask for his permission. It existed because they made it so. Every lie, every betrayal, every scar had carved its shape, and now Kaelith was nothing if not the living embodiment of what they had forced upon him. In this truth, he no longer felt weak. He no longer felt broken. He felt inevitable. The demon was not cruelty without reason. It was not madness or chaos. It was clarity sharpened into form. It was the realization that compassion had no place in a world built on deception, that mercy was a chain disguised as virtue. Kaelith no longer sought redemption, because redemption belonged to the man he used to be. The demon did not care for forgiveness. It cared only for balance, for retribution, for ensuring that no wound inflicted on him remained unanswered. What once had been survival now burned with purpose, and in that purpose he felt more alive than he ever had before. Those who looked at him could not understand what they saw. To them he was colder, distant, a shadow of his former self. They thought he had become hardened by grief. They could not see the truth, that grief had long since burned away, leaving something else in its place. Kaelith no longer needed their understanding. The demon inside him was not meant to be explained. It was meant to be unleashed. It was meant to exist as a truth too dark for others to face, but too real for him to deny. Each step he took, each breath he drew, carried the weight of this new existence. He did not hide from it anymore. He welcomed it. The demon gave him strength where weakness once lived. It gave him purpose where despair had taken root. It gave him a voice when silence had suffocated him. He had become something unrecognizable not only to others but to himself, and yet for the first time he felt honest. The mask was gone, the pretense abandoned. The demon was not a disguise. It was the truth, raw and undeniable. There were no more battles within him, no more desperate attempts to hold on to a light that no longer belonged to him. The war inside his soul had ended, and the victor was the very thing betrayal had birthed. Kaelith no longer mourned what he had lost because mourning belonged to the man who still believed in salvation. The demon did not mourn. It remembered, it calculated, it endured, and it struck when the time came. It was not an enemy to be feared or a curse to be lifted. It was the final form of everything he had become, and the only truth that mattered. Kaelith did not think of himself as broken anymore. He did not think of himself as lost. Those were words for people who still had hope of returning to who they once were. For him there was no return. There was only forward, and forward meant embracing the demon fully. He accepted the shadows in his reflection, the fire in his eyes, the silence on his lips. He accepted that the man who once believed in love had died, and in his place stood something forged of betrayal, silence, and vengeance. The demon was not just inside him. It was him. His scars were no longer reminders of pain, but symbols of rebirth. His silence was no longer emptiness, but a weapon. His heart was no longer fragile, but hardened into something unbreakable. In the end, there was no Kaelith and the demon. There was only one, and that one was the only truth that remained.